Okay, I'm going to get started because people don't really want to hear me, but there's some interesting stuff tonight. So welcome to the British Empire Study Group, to our March meeting. Time is flying. For people who haven't joined us before, we are basically a group of philatelists that enjoy talking about stamps and the stamp story. So you don't have to be a true, like a true philatelist. We are very liberal with our definition of British Empire, as you will see from next month's show, where we're doing the inaugurations of the United States, which was once part of the British Empire. So we're very liberal. If you flew over, if you flew over it, it counts. So tonight we're going to do something a little different. I wanted to just have a quick moment of silence or remembrance of Irene Bromberg. Irene was a very dear friend. She was the club secretary for 22 years. And we lost Irene on March 1st, tragically. And again, I wanted to honor her. She was a great member of the British Empire Study Group. She's a member of the Debbie's Adult Stamp Collector Group, and just an all-around really good person. So those of you who were fortunate to know Irene probably agree with me. Those who did not meet her, have the opportunity to meet her. You really did miss meeting a very special person. So we'll move on to other things. We have tonight, you'll see on the side of your screen, you have Rob Lutens. And Rob, if you could say a few words, Rob's helping me out. And anyone who wants to help out Rob, we'll take all the help we could handle, right?
You got that right.
So
yeah. I started collecting in 1954 at Christmas. My folks gave me one of those boxes from Minkus that had the little album and then the coat of arms and the flags in it, and I was geeked about it as soon as I saw it. And probably going on at the same time was I had a huge crush on the new Queen Elizabeth. I thought she was beautiful, and I wanted to go to the stamp store right after Christmas and get something, put into my new album. And I saw the Coronation series, and I was hooked. So that was just the beginning of it, and then started seeing all those different queens and kings heads on those British stamps, and there was no end to it, and I'm still doing it.
Well, we're really glad to have you here helping. That is terrific. And anyone who wants to, yeah, and just shoot us an email and we'd love to have you. So next meeting, it will be on April 14th with Henry Sawyer. And this is the early inaugurations. This is going to be a little different. We're going to do a little bit of a walking tour of some of the actual spots in New York. So for those of you who who've never traveled to New York, you'll get to see some of the spots. And for people who have traveled to New York, a lot of times you miss some of these locations, like Trinity Church. So it should be fun. It will be different. And if it doesn't go over well, we won't ever do it again. So, and we will also have a live dinner there. So anyone who would like to come and join us for dinner, you are more than welcome. It will be Dutch treats. So just a caveat. So a little housekeeping questions. If you please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat. The Q&A might be better, so Rob has a chance to see them at the end. Following this presentation, we'll have a social. So you'll have plenty of time to interact with Bob. So you see Bob, Rob, so it's a little, might get confusing, but you'll keep them out. And if you have any topics, please feel free to let me know. So that's it. And with that, I am going to introduce you to Robert Scott. And I'm not going to read his introduction. I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about himself. So Robert, thank you. Bob Scott, thank you for being here. And
Jane, my pleasure.
Take it away, and I'll bring up your slide deck.
Good evening. My name's Bob Scott. I'm the philatelic consultant for Sotheby's New York in an association that goes back nearly 30 years. And we're here tonight to chat about the British Guiana, the most valuable, the rarest. It's been lauded with many, should we say, compliments over the years. And this is really the story. The reason I'm telling it was I was the cataloguer for the sale in 2014, and I was brought back and I catalogued it for a second time, correcting some of the mistakes from the first time last year. For those that don't know, the first time out it sold for nearly 9.5 million, and last year it sold again for 8.3 million. What I would like to do is to give a background of British Guiana and of the stamps that led up to the issuing of the 1 cent Magenta and the story of the stamp to date. So without further ado, I think we shall begin. Do we have the first slide? Yes, we do. I think we could go back one, actually. We'll go to the stamp itself. Right, strange little octagonal red stamp. Technically, this is the British Guiana 1856 1 cent on magenta surface colored paper. It's catalogued number 23 by Stanley Gibbons and number 13 by Scott. It's informally known as the 1 cent black on magenta, just 1 cent magenta, or just simply the British Guiana. And I'll be interchanging those all the way through, otherwise we'll all get rather bored. It's the only stamp known just by the name of its country of origin. And it is the rarest and most valuable stamp in the world. And here's a story. British Guiana. British Guiana is a small colony. You can see it here. This is a slightly old map. It's on the left-hand page. It's the country that basically fills up the center of the page. It sits between Venezuela and Dutch Guyana, which is presently known as Suriname. It was originally made up of 3 small colonies, Essequibo, Berbice, and Demerara, until it was finally combined in 1831. Reputedly, it was seen by Columbus on its 3rd voyage and was visited by none other than Sir Walter Raleigh, who visited it in the late part of the 16th century as part of his quest in the search of El Dorado. Didn't work out terribly well for Walter Raleigh. He went back, was arrested and executed. From the shore, well, sorry, from the sea looking at the shore, it looks like marshland and river estuaries. And for the most part, was pretty much uninhabited until the various colonists started showing up. Now, like many of the countries in the area, its history is a combination of, pass the parcel with the European superpowers. It's been French, it's been British, it's been Dutch, but it finally settled into British rule in 1814. And it was used for cultivation. The main crop, of course, being sugar. Demerara sugar, still very popular throughout the world, but it also grew cotton, coffee, coconuts, and because of the sugar, obviously rum, which I think has remained popular up to the present day. All this labor was carried out by slaves until 1834. And it would be nice to say that slavery ended in 1834, but the British had a rather nasty habit of finding a way around it, and they created indentured servitude. And from 1834 to about 1917, about 250,000 inhabitants of mostly India, but also China, were drafted in under conditions which basically couldn't be described as anything more than slavery. The main town in the county of Demerara was Stabroek under the Dutch, changing its name to Georgetown, which it still retains today. Second biggest town was in Berbice, which is New Amsterdam. Population in the time period we're talking about, which is sort of 1850, 1860, was about 150,000. But 150,000 spread over 90 square miles is pretty thin. And bear in mind that of those 150,000, numbers chopped and changed a little bit, only 10,000 were white, and that was probably the literate population that was or had any interest in the sending or receiving of mail. Give you an idea, at about the same time, Boston at 30 square miles had a population that was pretty much the same. So people were very, very, very thin on the ground. British Guiana today still, the population still hasn't reached 1 million. So let's talk a little bit about the early mails and the post office. There we go. We're going to get an image. Here we go. Like most of the area, there was no formal mail service. If you wanted to send mail back to the homeland, it was really a packet boat system, which ran from the 1700s under various guises. It essentially meant giving your mail to a ship's captain and paying him probably quite a lot of money and just hoping the mail got to its destination. Expensive, unreliable, and of course no inland mail because really there wasn't anybody to send it to. And even when a main post office was finally opened in Georgetown in 1796, followed by a sub-post office in New Amsterdam in 1813, there really wasn't much for service. The rates weren't fixed, corruption was rife, and much as before, delivery was sporadic. As a result, the Admiralty, the British Admiralty, took over in 1823, finally ceding control to the Royal Mail in 1842. Postmasters were appointed, but they tended to come and go with alarming regularity. That was until the appointment of one Edward Thomas Evans Dalton in 1837. It sounds a little bit long-winded going through his name, but his initials ETED are actually rather pertinent to the story. In 1837, the post office had actually moved to the public buildings, which you can see here. They're now the Parliament buildings, but they still retain the title to an awful lot of people. And this is where Dalton and the post office would have been working from 1850 onwards, which is the period that we're really concerned with. Dalton was a sort of rather strange, well, let's say he was outgoing, he was charming, and he was a bit of a rebel. His family business was the post office. He was the son of a postmaster, and he was actually the father of a postmaster. So definitely a family business. And as I said, he was a colourful character, and he was well liked. And probably most fortunately, one of the people that liked him was the governor. In spite of being hired and fired at least 3 times, he actually managed to retain his position until 1874. So let's see, 37 years in business. So he must have done something right. Like many of his predecessors, and he can be included, he did actually try to establish local delivery. but really without any success until 1850. His ideas ranged from the sort of sublime to the ridiculous. He had a system in, I think it was 1839, where he wanted to use the police force for actually delivering mail. He had a second go in 1846. Unfortunately, this was cancelled because the authorities declared it illegal. Finally, in 1850, the colony petitioned the UK government, which they had to do, to actually inaugurate an official inland mail service. And this is how the first stamps of British Guiana began. And the first stamps were the cotton reels. Now, all the stamps we're going to discuss today are scarce. These are very scarce. The announcement was made on the 1st of June that this new system was going to come into operation. Now, Dalton being Dalton, he hadn't actually waited for permission from the government. In fact, the permission to actually do what he did didn't turn up until 3 months later. And of course, he didn't have access to any stamps. So what he did was make his own. But the principle of the mail system was to be a rather bizarre system of what they call distance traveled by ounce. So if you had a letter weighing an ounce, you could send it reasonably locally for 4 cents, which you can see here on the right-hand side. Or if it was sort of middle distance, which in a rather large country, it would be 8 cents. And if, say, from Georgetown, you wanted to send a letter to, let's say, the 70 miles to New Amsterdam, you'd have to pay the full rate of 12 cents. Very expensive. But he sorted out a system, and he actually had 20 receiving stations, which included the 2 post offices, general stores, and even the police force. It was no coincidence that the railways had been established in 1848. So this really made the system practicable for the first time, because mail could be moved, even though it wasn't really an awfully large amount. Now, because there were no stamps on hand, our postmaster, Mr. Dalton, walked up the road from the building we just looked at and into the offices of the publishers of the Royal Gazette of British Guiana, which was published by Baum and Dallas. That would be Joseph Baum and William Dallas. Baum was an American, came from Philadelphia, and he actually ran the business. Dallas, how can we describe him? He was described much, much later by a colleague who met him in 1835. He was a light mulatto and, to quote, a more perfect gentleman and a better printer I had never met with. He was educated in Scotland and acquired the art of printing there, and all branches of which he was a perfect master. The actual printer of the stamps was a chap by the name of Henry Mackay. And these are very, very primitive. They were created by bending, just twisting a 3-inch piece of printer's rule and soldering it to form a perfect circle, or a near perfect circle. And then essentially he just put in the type, British Guiana, very, very simple, and then cents. And there were 4 types produced, and for each type a different colored paper was used, and they just changed the sort for the date, whether it be a 4 or an 8 or 12, and printed it on the appropriate colored paper. 4 cent on orange, which then changed to yellow. The orange was actually, to me, it looks just like yellow anyway. The 8 cent was on green and the 12 cent on blue. Now, to save paper, the stamps were printed. There were 4 types that were believed printed in rows of 4, and they were printed on basically white sugar paper. But to save paper, the stamps were, each alternate row when printed on the paper was just slightly offset. So imagine if you're cutting cookies with a cookie cutter, you know how you just move them up. So the stamps would have the rows would have slightly overlapped each other, which meant cutting them up, you couldn't really cut them into, you couldn't cut them in straight lines and end up cutting the stamp square. So this is probably the reason, and you can see it with the stamps here, that the stamps were all individually cut out. Sometimes, as you see on the left, they were cut on the, you know, in a circle, and on the right, as with the British Guiana, you will see that it's cut in an octagon. The stamp in the middle is sort of a combination of both. Anyway, the last part of the stamp, once they were finished, was a trick that they'd basically stolen from the New York Postmaster's Provisionals. They had either the postmaster or the clerk sign each one before they went off. It's a little hard to see in the issues here, but each one of the cotton reels, as they're known, were signed ETED, Edward Dalton, the postmaster, either JBS with JB Smith, a clerk, H.A. Kilkenny, who was maybe a railway clerk, W.H. Lorimer, who was a clerk, and E.D. White, E.D.W. We'll be hearing more about him later because he signed a fairly well-known stamp that we're going to be talking about. Initially, it was a popular system, but unfortunately, it was too expensive for the people in the far reaches, and it was enthusiastically welcomed, but it was never going to be sustainable because it was just too much money. There was one other cotton reel that was issued, and that was a 2 cent, which is coming up now. The 2 cent was issued for, can we see the picture of the 2 cent? There we are. This is actually a pair of 2 cents on a cover, a very famous cover that was sent to a Miss Rose. The 2 cent was not designed to pay regular mail. It was designed for a local service that was in operation for a very, very few short months in 1852 for just local delivery in Georgetown. Again, enthusiastically welcomed, and then nobody used it. It fell into disrepute, and the stamps are as rare as hen's teeth. There are only 4 single examples known, and much later on, 3 pairs of which this is one on cover were discovered. This one wasn't actually discovered until 1896. Again, they were signed. Dalton signed a couple of them, White signed a couple of them, and Smith signed 6 of them. Beautiful cover. They quickly fell into disrepute, but by far the rarest. Now later on in 52, I'm sorry, the 2 cent cotton reel was actually 1851. Very soon afterwards, everything organized with the post office, the authorities in London sent British Guiana its first stamps. These were printed by Waterlow and Sons. They were very reminiscent of the 1856 issue and the 1 cent Magenta. In fact, this is the first Magenta stamp of British Guiana. It's rather interesting that it picked up the name Magenta because the actual word magenta didn't even exist in the 1850s. It was coined after a dye was discovered in 1860 and was named after the Battle of Magenta, which took place sometime in 1859. They were told they were regular. They were actually quite primitive, and they were some of the first issues printed by the famous stamp printer Waterlow and Sons. They lasted for approximately a year. They are terribly rare again, but they are known in multiples, and they're a very, very complex design, even though you really can't see it. It looks like a ship just stuck between the motto of the colony, which was Damus Patimus qui vicissum, which is we give and respect and expect in return. Although Waterloo weren't aware of this, and they spelt petimus patimus, so there's an error. But if you look very carefully at it, at the left there's a fort, and on the right of the ship there is actually another ship. So quite a complex design, but still a very primitive stamp. And the most important part is they'd finally gotten rid of this ounce weight over distance. These were regular postage stamps. The 1 cent was for newspaper delivery, and the 4 cent for regular delivery anywhere in the continent. But very, very short-lived. In 1853, Waterloo had started to figure out how to print stamps. And these are the first stamps printed in color on white paper. Up to now, it had just been black on colored paper. And here we have a 1 cent vermilion and an 1853 4 cent blue. The stamps were perfect. They paid the rent. They looked like stamps. Postmasters no longer had to sign them. And they finally got, it seemed like everything was going well. The first issues arrived. They were used. People liked them. They liked the system. And as is normal in 1854, they needed more supplies from England. And you think the shipping distance going backwards and forwards, they had to issue at least a year in advance. Now, as the story goes, in 1854, they issued 50,000 of each value. And then in September of 1855, the stamps arrived. But apparently somebody had misread the order and they were only sent 5,000 of each value. I am not convinced that these numbers are even vaguely correct. But the upside was, by January of 1856, the colony was running out of stamps. Hence the need for the next issue, the emergency issue, the 1856 Provisionals. Now, it must have been January of 1856 that the stamps had actually started running out. Postmaster Dalton, who apparently just could deal with a crisis without any problems whatsoever, wandered straight down to the printers that he'd used before, Dallas and Baum, and ordered up a new set of stamps. And they existed for a very short period, from January to probably issued in January, first known used in February, and the new replacement stamps turned up probably in September, October. So the window was really just sort of February through September. So they used for a very, very short amount of time. And they came in different fashions. We have a 4 cent. The first one was a 4 cent black on magenta, exactly the same as the 1 cent black on magenta, but obviously the 4 cent. The strange thing is people were used to a 4 cent in blue. They were actually used to a 1 cent in red. So there's a slight anomaly why the red stamps were 4 cents or why the 4 cents were red. It was probably due to the fact that they didn't have blue ink. So they had to print on Brent, which may well have been from a local dye. The blue stamps come later, so they're really after the story. The interesting thing about the 56 is that they are incredibly complex. They actually have 4 pieces of printer's rule, British Guiana top and bottom, the motto in the middle, a little piece, the ship motif in the middle, and altogether it's 61 pieces of type that actually created this stamp. But the one we're going to be interested in is the one that only had 60 pieces of type, because 4 has one has one less piece than 4. Now, 1856. For some reason, a 1 cent appeared on a piece of mail and was shipped. Must have been purchased sometime in March or April, placed on a letter or a newspaper. I think it was probably mistaken for a 4 cent and placed on a letter and sent to a man named Andrew Hunter. Andrew Hunter, for some reason, kept this piece of mail and actually left it in his belongings until he disappeared off to Barbados in 1872 after living in the colony for 42 years. His papers went to his immediate family, and his, I think, grand nephew, a 12-year-old schoolboy, and the famous 12-year-old schoolboy, discovered this one strange 1 cent stamp sitting on a piece of paper, sitting on the cover, and he dutifully soaked it off and possibly assumed he was going to find another one. But he did find it. He obviously had made a note of it and thought it was probably something good. Strange thing is, he lived very close to where the stamp was printed. He lived half a mile away from where it had been cancelled and where it had been initialed. He obviously didn't think very much of it. As a budding stamp collector, he was far more interested in the bright new stamps that were coming out, and was very happy when he received the chance to sell it so that he could buy some of the great new stamps. The man he sold it to was believed to be a family friend. And this is a dreadful picture of him, because he was in his 20s at the time, a young Scotsman by the name of Neil Ross Mackinnon. He was a lawyer, and he was actually quite a prolific stamp collector. He collected certainly from the early 1870s up until 1877, and he had a remarkably good collection of stamps, as was evident when he sold one of his stamps to a dealer in England in 1877. He had one of the, he had one of the 2 cent cotton reels, and up to that time, nobody had actually ever seen one. And he sold it to a dealer called Thomas Ridpath in London. Ridpath saw it, recognized its value, and bought it, and spent probably in the region of £15. Seeing his good fortune, he sent a further 2 copies. He actually, at some point, owned all 4 single copies. He sent 2 more copies during 1877, and then realized that with the incredible popularity of British Guiana stamps, which had happened in this very, very short period, dealers were posting advertising in British Guiana and paying ridiculous amounts of money for these old stamps. It created a gold rush. Office boys were basically looting the stocks of the offices that they worked on desperately to find the old records with old mail. And a huge amount of these stamps turned up, but only 4 of the 2 cent cotton reels turned up. And it seems that Mackinnon owned all of them. He also owned this rather strange 1 cent stamp, which was quite incredible. So without further ado, and seeing the peak of the market coming, he sent his entire collection to England, and he sent it to Glasgow. And the reason why he sent it to Glasgow was he had a friend there called Robert Wiley Hill. Now, Robert Wiley Hill was actually the son of quite a famous store owner, and he became an incredibly famous store owner of his own. Wiley Hill's shop still stands in Glasgow in the Argyle Arcade, and he has and that was probably the preeminent store in Glasgow for most of the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, they weren't, I can't say whether it was Wiley Hill or whether it was Mackinnon. He wasn't sure whether it was genuine. So he sent his stamp off to Mr. Pemberton. Now, Edward Lloyd Pemberton was the be-all and end-all. He was the greatest philatelist of his age, and he was a comparative old-timer, being 33 at the time. All the characters we're going to meet are really all in their 20s because they'd taken up the great new hobby of stamp collecting. Pemberton, when seeing the stamp, wrote immediately to his friend and announced the fact that I've seen a 1 cent of the 1856 issue, and it's absolutely genuine. He'd been offered the chance to buy the collection for £110, but he was a little slow off the mark, and he'd sent the collection back, but he hadn't sent his check. Now, Wiley Hill was under strict instructions that if Pemberton didn't buy it, he should offer it around. So he sent out letters to probably Stanley Gibbons. There was a big dealer, Albert, in Bristol. And there was, of course, Thomas Ridpath, who had bought the first 2 cents. And Thomas Ridpath is shown next. He was so quick. He received a note on October 2nd saying that the collection was available. He got on a train. He was in Glasgow that night. At night before 9 o'clock the next morning, he bought this collection with another 2 cent cotton reel, but it also had this 1 cent black on magenta. And he wasted no time crossing the channel and going to see his best client. And his best client was the famous, very, very famous Count Philippe von Ferrari. Here is the back of the stamp, and from here on, everybody that bought the stamp has put their mark on it. And now we're going to go through the marks, starting with probably the greatest collector of them all. Here is Ferrari. Now, Ferrari was a small man. He was disheveled. He used to travel around. People used to mistake him for a tramp until they found out who he was, because he was the son of one of the richest families in France. He was actually one of the richest families in the world. He inherited a fortune of 150 million francs. And all he wanted to do was collect stamps and coins. And in stamps, he collected everything. And whenever he bought a stamp, he had lived in this really rather wonderful building. He would have them set out in trays, and he would mark them with, and you will see it in the top left, this what we call the Ferrari trefoil. And this appears on his whole collection. And to own something with this means it was part of the one of the greatest collections of all time. And this stamp stayed in his collection for some 38 years. It is said that he would go to a gallery, and if somebody pointed out to him that a painting on the wall was the most valuable thing there because it was worth £2,000, he would pull the stamp out of his pocket and say, my little painting is worth £3,000. He absolutely lived, ate, and breathed stamps. But unfortunately, all things come to an end. The stamp in Ferrari's collection was never seen by anybody. This is where it actually stayed. This is the Hotel Matignon, not a hotel. It's actually a palace. It is now the official residence of the Prime Minister of France. So it wasn't a particularly shabby address. But while the stamp lived here, it was not being seen by anybody. So it existed as a rumor. It was a mystery. People speculated. They said it existed. They weren't quite sure. And for years and years and years, people really didn't know until probably the greatest philatelist of all time emerged on the scene. And he's the person we're going to see next. This is Edward Denny Bacon. Now, philately wouldn't be philately without Bacon. He wrote, he studied, he was the curator for King George V, But as a 28-year-old in 1889, he wrote a book and he correctly listed all the stamps of British Guiana. And 2 years later, as a result, he was invited to Paris and he got to see it for the first time. And he explained that it was a poor copy, but without any shade of a doubt, it was absolutely genuine. This unfortunately annoyed a colleague of his, the older and very, very influential president of the Royal Philatelic Society, Judge Philbrick. Judge Philbrick, back one. Judge Philbrick hated the stamp. He believed it wasn't real. And he actually started a sort of minor feud, which was to go on forever and ever. And it all started because of a stupid misunderstanding. Because in 1878, he had seen an 1856 provisional that was a 4-cent red, but it was very badly damaged. And it was, you couldn't read it. You couldn't read the lettering quite well. And he believed that this was the stamp that Ferrari had bought. The truth was, Ferrari had bought the stamp and it had only been seen by Pemberton. It had only been seen by Ridpath. It had been seen by McKinnon and Vernon Vaughan in British Guiana. But unfortunately, Pemberton had died 2 months after seeing it, died just after his 34th birthday. And so Philbrick never knew that he hadn't seen the stamp. Anyhow, there was a huge fight and it ended up that Philbrick resigned actually from the Royal Philatelic Society, and Denny took over, but there was still this cloud hanging over the stamp. Apparently the bad copy that he saw ended up with a European nobleman and might very well be the so-called second copy that showed up in the 80s and 90s. It was owned by the forger, Peter Winter. It is wrong. It's been to the Royal Philatelic Society a couple of times. It is just wrong. And unfortunately, its legacy has persisted, which has sort of messed things around. Anyhow, very sadly, Ferrari died in the back of a cab in 1917 on his way back from a stamp dealer. And because he'd taken Austrian citizenship and his stamps were in France, the French government first sequestered, and then they actually seized the collection and decided to sell it for war reparations. Stamp was organized into 14 sales beginning in 1841. Beginning in 1921. And the British Guiana first came for sale on the 5th of April, 1922. So we're almost at the 100th anniversary. This is the first time it was photographed. Here is the catalogue description. Catalogue. And here is the very first photograph. You'll see it at the bottom of the picture. It's rather good. The description, very, very simple. The 1 cent black on magenta, noir sur carmine, the only known example, and the known example it was. And it was expected that there would be a fight, and indeed there was a fight to come and own for it. It was the only stamp missing from the collection of George V, who we see here on the left. And it was also of great interest to the Alsatian tobacco magnate Maurice Burris, who was pretty much buying everything that was anything at that time. Now, there was one other person, there were many, many at the auction, but there was only one other person that had the means to buy. And this was his agent. This is Hugo Griebert. And he'd actually talked his American boss into buying this stamp, or at least making a significant bid. And it was Griebert that fought it out with Burris. Expected to sell for 150,000 francs. The hammer finally fell at 300,000 francs, which with premiums and taxes came to 350,000 francs, about $32,500. It was interesting at the end of it. The auction was quite a busy affair. And at the end, the auctioneer didn't actually know who made the last bid. Boris very graciously actually leaned over and nodded towards Grebert and gave it to him. Turned out the buyer wasn't actually an American. It was this man, Arthur Hind. And Arthur Hind was just a regular, he was a regular Yorkshireman from Bradford, but he'd actually traveled to America and made something called plush, which was all the seating that was in the newfangled cars and trains that were being built at an alarming rate. He was so successful that it was calculated that at some point he was earning $1 million a year. And he made this wonderful little mark here, which is the 14-point star. Originally, because if you can look at it, if it pops out a little bit, you can see a clover leaf. Now, we originally believed this clover leaf, which actually has the initials AH written on each leaf, had been obliterated by the star, by his rather unfriendly ex-wife, who actually ended up with the stamp afterwards. But it turns out it was actually Hind's mark. We're going back to this 2-cent cotton reel cover that we saw earlier, and look, it's the same mark. Now, Hind's estranged ex-wife had no access to this, so this must have been the stamp that Hind actually had. And it was obviously a failed experiment. He was trying to emulate Ferrari, but once it was inked, it was too fine of a design, and it ended up being a bit of a splodge rather than anything else. Here's Arthur Hind, who, unlike Ferrari, took the stamp on a trip, took it to shows. He would mail it in just a regular registered envelope. He'd send it everywhere. And it was actually coming back from one of these shows that ended up its final destination after his demise. The great story of the Hind ownership is, let's go back. We'll talk about Arthur very quickly. The great story of the Hind ownership is shortly after he bought it, another collector knocked on his door and said, "Mr. Hind, look at this, I've got another one. Would you like to buy it?" Hind apparently said yes, handed the money, took the stamp. Guy said, "Thank you very much. You now own both of the rarest stamps in the world." Hind put a match to the stamp and burned it. He looked at the man and said, "There is only one British Guiana." 1929 came and the crash came. Hind lost a lot of his wealth. He also had married the year previously to a woman who was 30 years his junior, and both his fortune and his marriage collapsed around 29 along with his health. He didn't live, well, he lived until 1933 when he died, but not after a rather acrimonious divorce, where he stated, "My wife can have the contents of the house and a few odds and bits and pieces, but she can't have my fortune and she can't have my stamp collection because that's going to my family in England." Well, it turns out that the stamp was still in an envelope when it had come back from one of the shows and was in the house. House actually still stands. It's a little 3-bedroom place and really not the sort of place you would expect a multimillionaire to live. But Anne Hines Scala said, "The stamp's in my house, I get the house and the contents," and the court agreed with her, and she got the stamp and immediately went about trying to sell it. But she had great difficulties. She put it up for sale at Harmer in London in 1935, hoping to sell it to King George V, who could and probably would have bought it, except for the fact that he had become ill and was died shortly after or shortly before the sale. The stamp received a bid of £7,500, which was more than the $32,500. It was about $37,000, but that wasn't enough for Mrs. Scala, so the stamp remained unsold. It's rather interesting if you look at that catalogue notion. The catalogue describes the stamp as an error. Well, we don't need to dwell on that. So on to, finally, the stamp went for that picture we had actually of Anne Hind, who was a very pretty woman, was taken at the New York World's Fair, where the stamp, under great ceremony, turned up in an armored car. It didn't sell there, but it was obviously made quite clear that it was for sale. And a man who'd actually exhibited there, actually his company, the Ceylonese company, he'd been involved in the development of rayon and made a fortune from it, had actually exhibited at the World's Fair along with DuPont, who of course we will get to in short order. The man never actually made his name public, although within the stamp world he was actually quite well known. His name was Frederick Small, and he was an Australian chemical engineer. And he didn't buy the stamp, he wasn't a collector, he was merely an investor, although he bought a substantial amount of very, very good British Guiana stamps. And his little mark, which is the last ink mark, which is, you know, shows some sense, is a comet. And Frederick Small, he did display the stamp. He was good with that, but he had somebody else do all the work for him. And the man who did the work for him also marked it. You can see it here. It's the FK in the center. And that FK stands for Finbar Kenny, who was the head of the stamp department at Macy's, who organized the sale to Small and who actually accompanied the stamp on its various trips. Here he is going to London for the Stanley Gibbons centenary in 1965. Prior to that, the stamp had actually been featured in an article in Life magazine titled "The $1 Million Stamp Collection." And the rather clever thing about this is, we've got a picture here. You can't see it clearly, but somebody had the bright idea of actually taking a picture of the back end of the stamp. So you can actually see it with Hind and Ferrari and FK, yes, Finbar Kenny's mark there, and Small's little comet. It also appeared as a prop point in a Scrooge McDuck cartoon book. Anyhow, here we go. In 1970, Frederick Small decided to sell his collection. So he sent it off to Robert A. Siegel in New York. And this is the absolute best picture of the British Guiana. The late, great Andy Levitt, who was the auctioneer, sitting behind the bars with the stamp. This was again from a Life magazine article. The stamp sale was set for March 24th. And I can remember this because I just turned 8 years old. And it's proved that I think Fred Small had a really good idea for investing. He paid $45,000 for it. It's not actually known. But at auction in 1970, March 24th, it sold for $280,000. Finally, crossing that barrier, the $250,000 barrier. And this is a wonderful anomaly. 2 days later, the rest of Small's collection came up with Robson Lowe in England. And it was lot 65, yet unfortunately, having sold 2 days previously, this was the auction that never was. Anyway, the buyer of the stamp in that great sale in 1970 was the great old dealer, Irwin Weinberg. And Irwin is his pencil mark, IW. He got together with a group of investors known as the Wilkes-Barre Eight, and they decided to carry on with the investment, but at a much higher level. And Irwin popularized the stamp. This is the great picture. The stamp is in the briefcase, which I have seen. It is handcuffed to his wrist, and there is the very present armed guard with a gun. He traveled to India. He traveled all through Europe. He traveled to Australia. He traveled to Japan. Actually, they made a great fuss at it in Japan. I had the great pleasure of talking to him before we sold the stamp in 2014. He was still absolutely the great showman. He was still mimeographing his stamps for his client list. And he came to the sale in 2014 and he wanted to throw out the first bid. Unfortunately, he was sort of beaten to it. But a great, great, great man. But as he said, after 10 years, he wasn't quite sure whether he owned the stamp or the stamp owned him. So he sent it back to auction, and with a great deal of trepidation, because he had no idea whether somebody was going to buy it. Apparently on the night of the sale at the Waldorf Astoria, Robert A. Siegel, and it was Bob Siegel who was conducting the auction, that he got a note. He had a conversation with Bob Siegel, and he said, "We're all right." And the reason he was all right was because this man, John DuPont, heir to the sort of eponymous DuPont chemical fortune, had put a bid in for the stamp. And on, it's April 5th, 1980, the stamp was purchased for $935,000, making Irwin very happy, not only because he got his money back, made a profit, but also because he finally passed it on to someone else. And DuPont's signature is pencil, and you can just about make it out here, which is good. And I'm not going to labor, most people know the DuPont story, but between 1980 and 1988, he was a stamp collector. He put together a fabulous collection of British Guiana stamps. All the stamps, he owned all the best examples of all the stamps that I described earlier. He put the stamps on display at Ameripex in 1986, which is a show where I sent a collection. He won the Grand Prix. He sent it off to Australia. And the one great story was it came back late from Australia. And yes, he did sleep with the stamp under his pillow one night. But sadly, 1996, he killed the wrestler, Dave Schultz. He was convicted. He was sent to prison for 13 to 30 years. And in 2010, he died. The estate took a while to sort out, but eventually the stamp came back to auction, and it came to Sotheby's. And I remember the day I got the call, and it was quite simply, "What's the rarest stamp in the world?" I said, "The British Guiana." I said, "Do you want to write the catalogue?" And this is the catalogue. Up until now, the description had been one line. Putting together a 50-page catalogue took a while, which is why I was probably a little bit sort of information heavy when we started this chat, but it was remarkable how little information there actually was on the stamp. There were just snippets everywhere, but the internet is a wonderful thing and allowed us to put together really the story from beginning to end. I mean, it's quite incredible. There are actually photographs of everybody who owned it, you know, right up from the 12-year-old schoolboy who found it in 1873. Anyhow, the stamp, which took place in June of 2014, a lot of fanfare, an awful lot of cameras, and it sold for 9.48 million to this man, who again remained a mystery for a while, but was finally revealed to be Stuart Weitzman, the famous shoe designer. And there's his mark on the left, which he signed at the Smithsonian in 2019, as you will see from the picture. His actual, we've talked about all the marks and all the, and this is one actually being applied. Now, everybody, as I said, from small has made pencil markings, so it's a good thing. They can be removed if necessary, and this is quite a strident one, but if you pay $9.5 million for a stamp, you can actually do what you want with it. Anyhow, Stuart Weitzman never really took possession of the stamp, put it on display. It resided at the Smithsonian, where here he is shown signing it. Took some time off to go to the stamp show in 2016. It went to Monaco in 2017. And then in 2021, Mr. Weitzman decided to sell the stamp. And here I am at the sale. We sold the British Guiana together with the inverted Jenny plate block and the 1933 $20 gold piece. And even though the stamp sold for 8.3 million, about a little over $1 million less than it sold the first time, the three objects together had cost him 22 million, and the three objects sold for a total of 32 million. So didn't do too badly, and all the money went to a charitable foundation. So no real complaints there. The buyer was the one that had missed out. Even though 100 years after his death, Stanley Gibbons had missed, Edward Stanley Gibbons had missed buying it in 1878, but in 2021, the firm bearing his name did buy it. And if you want a piece of it, you can now buy one of 80,000 shares at £100 or $130 each. Quite fascinating. I wish them well. I think this is a new venture, and well, I suppose maybe it will come up for sale again, but I'm dying to see what Stanley Gibbons puts as their mark on the back. Anyway, there we have it, the British Guiana, 1 cent black on magenta. It's a strange thing. If you look at it very carefully in the center, you'll see a little, just between the motto, Damus and Petimus, you'll see a tiny little bit of a hinge. When we first published photographs, people complained that it was out of focus and there was something on the camera. The truth is, when DuPont actually had it, he, for some reason, ended up with a piece of a stamp hinge that got stuck on the front. And that used to be about 4 times the size. And I very carefully removed it. And the reason why it looks the way it does is because this is the first time it's ever been photographed properly. It is, as Edward Denny said in 1891, it appears, it is perfectly genuine, but it appears rubbed. And that's what it is. Thank you very much indeed. I hope that has been somewhat informative. Look forward to some questions.
That was wonderful, Robert.
Well, thank you very much. That was a fascinating story.
I'm sorry.
Bob, I am going to ask you, if I could, to ask some questions while I move everybody over. So you could ask Bob Scott some questions yourself. It's a fascinating story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay.
Bob, we have a question here from Jamian. They ask, I can understand it being referred to as the most valuable stamp, but why is it still called the world's rarest stamp when there are other unique stamps around the world? For example, the US Z grill, etc.
Well, first of all, the 1 cent Z grill isn't unique. So it's rare, but it's not as rare. But there are thousands of stamps that are unique for one reason or other. The reason why it's called the rarest stamp in the world is because that was the term that was coined when it was, probably in the 1950s. I think the Life magazine, it became the poster child of rare stamps, and the rarest. No, it's a silly superlative, but it's stuck, so I'm not going to change it.
Right. Another viewer is asking the story about Hind when he burned up the second copy. Is that true?
No, it's absolute rubbish. It's completely apocryphal. If you really look into where it was also published after, I think it was first published just after the death of Hind. And it was the sort of story you wanted to be true. But Hind was actually, Hind was a great, he was a very friendly, a very affable guy. There is no doubt he would have told the story, and he knew enough people that he would have told the story to. So no, it's a wonderful story, but it's a tale.
Okay. Another question, some of the other stamps that you showed, the cotton wheels, how do they stack up in value, compared to the 1 cent?
Well, nothing stacks up with the 1 cent, but the cotton reels are, you have to remember that in 1877, when the 2 cent cotton reel especially, there are, reasonable numbers of the 4 8s and 12s because they were saved. But the 2 cents are so incredibly scarce. Nothing exists on a newspaper. And of course, technically it was a newspaper stamp. You'd have to think that, and also many of the 2 cent cotton reels are institutions. In institutions, there are only 2 of the 2 cents and 2 of the covers loose. The 2 cent covers maybe 300,000-400,000, as opposed to hundreds of thousands rather than millions. Does that answer the question?
I believe it does. Bob. Another question relating to the construction of the stamps themselves. Do we know much about the chemistry, about the dyes?
No, we don't. There has been, I know that, I don't think there's been a formal spectrographic analysis, which is a shame because it spent so much time at the Smithsonian and they have the facilities to do it. Once you have the signature of the color, you could probably have a go at identifying the ink. There's a chica plant, and there's another one which, I can't remember the name of it. There's chica and there's another one, and they are indigenous dyes to British Guiana, and they bear, one at least bears a very strong resemblance to the magenta color, even though it's, the ink on all of them has aged a little bit. So the one thing we can be pretty sure of is in early 1856, they didn't have any blue ink. And red ink wasn't as popular then as it is now. So it would be really good if they could do this analysis, but this is something new for the future. Right. Once they get the signature, the dyes still exist. They could compare it and tell us for certain, which would be, it's something I would like to know.
Good point. I think it's really worth following up on some point in the future. We've had a couple questions also about these marks on the back of the stamp. I think some people are kind of appalled by, the fact that this, somebody would do that to a stamp of that value. Was it customary for owners of valuable stamps to mark them like that back in the day?
It certainly wasn't common for, Ferrari was the one that started it really with his mark, but I can't really throw stones because the people most guilty of marking the back of the stamps are the dealers and the experts, because there are numerous, there are books on the different hand stamps you can find on the backs of stamps, and almost none of them belong to collectors. So unfortunately, I think if there is any finger pointing, it's to the trade and the experts, because collectors as a rule don't make marks. The British Guiana is almost unique in the fact that it sort of carries its history on its back. I personally think I would far rather spend time looking at the back of the stamp than the front.
There's a story there.
Yeah.
Another
psychiatrist.
Yeah, right. Have any of the
when Sotheby's sold at the auction, they sent press releases out and one of the English newspapers printed the picture of the back of the stamp rather than the front.
Oh, well, good. Good.
It was the first time I'd seen the back, and it was a bit of a revelation.
Well, it's also, it's the ultimate in prime source, because you can be told that somebody owns something, but there's a certain joy in seeing a Ferrari mark on anything purely because of what it signifies. But it's the fact that you know the hand of the person you've written about actually made the mark or signed. We all, part of postal history is touching the past, and this is just a perfect example of it.
Yeah, of course, there's a difference between marking the back and marking the front. The Miss Rose cover, of course, marked in the front. I've got a cover where someone's cut off the corner where the Ferrari mark was.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, I didn't realise there had been one there until I saw an old catalogue.
Oh, you found? Oh,
yeah,
well,
I bought it with the corner cut off.
That's almost better, because then you get the joy. It's the joy of discovery, which is even better. So, yes, no, the marking of philatelic items is, I suppose, they become justified over time. I think a lot of people, when they bought in the Ferrari sale, didn't like having that little mark on it. But as time goes on, things have been better. There are also some, when I see certain US stamps, if I see an old collection and I turn over a stamp and it's got a WHC Warren Colson stamp on the back, that's a good thing. I like to see that, because there are certain people where there are certain stamps, there are certain Italian marks where you wince when you see them on the back. But there are certain people who you just respect. I stand in awe of Edward Denny Bacon, and I wish he'd have had a mark, because to me, that's an absolute guarantee of it being perfect. Because I think he's the greatest philatelist that ever lived.
I'm very pleased.
Which I might have made clear.
I'm very pleased that you agree with me that Edward Denny Bacon was the greatest postage stamp philatelist of all time. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. When he saw it in the Ferrari collection in 1891, he described it as somewhat rubbed, which is well recorded. The Royal Certificate describes it as being overpainted. How do you put together those two remarks?
Do you know, I'm not going to point fingers here, because I think it's unnecessary. And I remember when this was the first stamp I loved when I was 8 years old. So when I actually got to see it for the first time in 2014, it might actually have been 2013, I was, never meet your idols. I was absolutely, I was in shock. I mean, I'd heard about it and I saw it, and I was in awe of the stamp all the way through the time I catalogued it in 2014. The Royal was put in an impossible position, because it was delivered under rules which basically said you can look at it. I mean, they might as well have said you can look at it from 3 feet away. And it is my understanding that, because they'd certified it previously in 1935, I think Sir John Wilson signed the certificate. I think they looked at it, and from what I understand, they misplaced, they misplaced the file that they had on it. I felt there was a necessity to actually write something on the certificate, which, if they'd have been given full access and they'd have been allowed to conduct a a spectrometry test on it, then they would have been able to come to an opinion. I think that it was a decision made in haste, and I think it was incorrect.
It's very interesting that I was the consultant for Sotheby's in London. And I remember getting a phone call about the stamp and going in to see it and looking at the back of the stamp and thinking, gosh, it's more interesting on the back, as I think everyone agrees. But Bacon did describe it as somewhat rubbed, and Bacon, as you say, was extremely accurate. And it's now no longer somewhat rubbed. So it must have been repainted.
No, I absolutely disagree. I think well, first of all, the lighting and we can't ask him, so we don't know, but the lighting at the Hotel Matignon couldn't be very good, because there is no doubt it is very, very clear when you look at the stamp that the denomination is 1 cent and the cancellation is April 4th. He couldn't make out, he thought it was April 1st. So he had to have looked at it under slightly off conditions. And I would say that it does look like it's actually rubbed.
I think the ship in the middle is relatively under-inked compared to a lot of the 4 cent examples.
That's true, but the other thing that I don't think has ever really been taken into account is that we know that this stamp was delivered in April of 1856 and not discovered until 1873. And it lived in all places, the tropical humidity of British Guiana. And I think it must have, for it to have survived the way that it did, it certainly wasn't facing the sun. So it was covered, and it was, I think there's a very good chance that it was essentially cooked in a pressure cooker for 17 years. So again, I think scientific technology will change. But the thing is, I know informally that the Smithsonian did have a fairly good look at it, and their judgment, but it is not written, was the fact that it is all of the same ink. So for it to have been repainted at some point, then the ink would have had to have been reproduced, which I think in 19th century Paris would have been a little difficult.
I think I'd agree with you about that. I was the one that suggested that it should be seen by the Smithsonian and examined. And the one thing that didn't happen, that would have been very good if it had happened, would if the stamp was compared with a 4 cents.
Oh, absolutely.
And the ink was done, but that didn't take place. Presumably they couldn't get hold of a 4 cents. I really can't reconcile the two inks, but if Bacon, I mean, I was the curator of the Taplin collection, what Bacon wrote up. So in my view of Bacon, and we both share that view, if Bacon said it was somewhat rubbed, it was somewhat rubbed.
It's, yes.
I just want to make a technical, and I have moved everyone over. So if you're not over yet, please raise your hand and I will push you over again. You have to accept and turn your video on. And David Beach, thank you very much for that information. You're always a wealth of knowledge. We have a question from John Berger. So before I go, I'll point to John. He's been patient there.
Okay, I saw it in 1981 when Erwin Weinberg had it at the Palmer House in Chicago. I saw it again at the Smithsonian, and I saw it again at the '06 show in DC. It seems to be deteriorating. Is it?
That's the funniest thing about it. Obviously, having sort of physically touched it and seeing it without glass or anything in front of it, I was amazed. I could remember sitting in the mid-'80s in a room with Ronald Lee, the former president of the Royal Philatelic Society, and him telling me about how it was disgusting and it was repaired and it was horrible and all these things. So my expectation level was quite low when I first saw it. The funniest thing about it is, it doesn't matter how you photograph it. We've got fairly good pictures of it. Nothing compares with how it actually looks and you hold it in your hand. The other thing that is quite incredible about it is it's as crisp as a brand new $5 bill. It actually, you can, it is, which in a lot of ways the color looks burnished. I am of the opinion that it looks exactly like it did right from the get-go.
Thank you.
I think that if he were alive today, Lewis Vernon Vaughan would recognize it as the stamp he soaked off the envelope. Or the newspaper, I can't say the envelope. I think the best thing about it is I've spoken to lots of people who've seen it over the years. Some say it is, some say it isn't. It's one of the beautiful things about the stamp. It elicits a different opinion from everybody. As I said, if we could solve the mysteries of the ink, if we could solve how it was actually created, I think a lot of the myths have been dispelled. One of them that still exists, which is rather good, is if you go to British Guiana, they will show you the Columbia press used to print the British Guiana. There is no way on earth it was printed on a Columbia press. It was printed in plates of 2, and it was printed on, paper. You didn't run a huge printer backwards and forwards to create 2 stamps at a time. It was obviously printed on a hand press. I just like the fact that there are still questions that are not answered. My opinions are my own. They are by no means gospel. I listen to and appreciate everybody's viewpoint on it. And I think the day that everything is known and everything is, written in stone is the day the stamp ceases to be interesting.
Robert?
Yes.
First of all, my congratulations on a truly wonderful, what I would call forensic philately presentation. Really excellent. And for those of you who haven't had the privilege of seeing it, I would point out that in one of Roger Brodie's magnificent exhibits, he has the 4 missing corners. So you should all have a look at that exhibit when it comes up again. Thank you.
I will do. Thank you very much.
We have to add the caveat that Roger Brodie's exhibit is not an authentic exhibit. It's for those
no kidding.
It's one of those joke exhibits. Well, there's some people here who may not be aware that what Roger does to these things, and they might go back and quote it in some school paper that this guy in New York has the other 4 corners of this stamp. So we'll just stop him from getting an F.
I don't know what to say. I'm speechless.
Just full disclosure.
I think that's wonderful. I think that a little bit of levity goes an awfully long way, because we can't be too serious.
Robert, I got a question not regarding the condition of the stamp. What about the colors of the stamp? The actual color have been deteriorating through the years. Is that the case? And what's the expectation 100 years from now?
No, I don't think so. Well, first of all, I think we're getting to the point where, because there's the numbers and the value is so high, we're getting to a point where these great rarities are being hermetically sealed and protected, and the mount that we used, which I thought was particularly, the idea was right, but the implementation was not particularly good because the stamp actually moved around in the mount. But it was UV glass. They're so well protected, and trust me, Stanley Gibbons aren't going to let their investment go south. I wonder whether I will be the last person that ever actually touched it. So I don't think it's particularly deteriorated more than it did in British Guiana between 56 and 72. I don't think, we know from various that it essentially lived in the dark at the Hotel Matignon in France. I think Small had it kept in a bank vault. John Dupont had it in a bank vault. I think it's incredibly well protected. And when you think that there are so many stamps that have been on display, been in dealers' bourses, that are in our collections today, that have been exposed to the elements for more than 150 years, certainly more than 170 years if you collect early British line engraved, that the future for the stamp is probably very good because it will be protected. We're also very, very fortunate that almost the earliest stamps of the earliest countries, going from bullseyes from Brazil to line engraved to the 47 issues in the US to the Swiss cantonals. In the old days, they were made with such good materials, good raw materials. They were made with decent paper, with very simplistic, not chemical inks. The gum, if there was any gum, was gum Arabic, which lasted, which actually crackled nicely, giving a lovely patina. We're very fortunate that our early stamps are so rudimentary and so well made that they are actually designed for the long haul. My concern is actually for the stamps that were created really from the 1880s onwards, where, various chemicals, we know we have, obviously we have, the Norway #1, where the gum actually eats the stamp after a certain period of time, and numerous chemicals which deteriorate over time. No, classic stamps are seemingly designed for the long haul. The more modern one, it's like art. Contemporary art doesn't, I don't think a lot of contemporary art is designed to last, but the old masters have been around for 500 years. And I think the classic stamps are the old masters of the stamp world.
Robert, I've got a question for you. First of all, I'd like to congratulate you on an excellent presentation, which I found most enjoyable. I first saw the stamp in 1965 at the Stanley Gibbons exhibition in London.
Oh, brilliant.
I also attended Ameripex in 1976, and then I saw it in London in the year 2000. I'm a member of the International Association of Expert Philatelists, and I've got a virtually perfect memory of shades. When I first saw this stamp in 1965, the color was like a lightish magenta, but when I saw it in the year 2000, it was almost carmine. How do you account for the difference in color? Was it the lighting or what?
Well, I can only suggest, because obviously my point of view, my argument is that it's the same. So obviously my answer would say that the the lighting has changed. I will say, but I won't disagree with you, especially since I did not see it in 1965 or 2000. Lighting has changed dramatically from when it was on display at Sotheby's in 2014 to 2021. It looked different as well because you could never match the same lighting. So I would leave.
So it's not some sort of. So it's not some sort of oxidation.
Do you know? I don't think so. The strangest thing about looking at the stamp naked, as it were, is the fact that the color almost looks burnished. I have never seen a photograph that, I think we did one of the best photographs, but I sat down, I had this conversation with Charles at Harmer's, who's got young eyes, much younger than mine. And I actually took it out of the mount and we looked at it together. And I was trying to, and I said to him, tell me that that's the color you see in the photograph, or that's the color you see when it's behind the glass. And he said, I agree. It is just a unique color. But the word burnished is always the thing. It almost has like a bronzish burnished character, and it just does not photograph properly. So
that's how I remember.
Yeah, you may be right, but
yes. I do remember it looking slightly burnished in the year 2000, but in 1965 it wasn't burnished. That's the difference.
Well, you might have been right. I can't comment because I was 3 years old in 1965. However, I will say that I have spoken to other people who saw it in 65 and who thought it looked exactly the same. And I don't know, it might be interesting to ask Richard Ashton what he thinks, because he actually handled it in 1965.
Yeah, and I apologize for my photo not appearing. That wasn't intentional.
Oh, no offense taken. As I say, the color of it is a wonderful, it's one of those talking points and it'll never be sorted out. But I do know that if the Smithsonian did actually take any sort of, let's say, color measurement of it at all, then they will be able to do it again and see what the progression of time is from this point forward. Because if it is changing, I doubt very much. If it's changed, do you see what I mean? If it's changed in 55 years, then it will change more in the next 20. So maybe we'll have an answer in that way. But obviously artificial lighting, and it has been under artificial light, may provide the answers in the future.
Well, thank you very much for your explanation. This is something that has been bothering me for over 20 years.
Well, it's rather strange because I mean, you've been collecting stamps under different lights for forever and ever and ever. And you know, the strange thing, because when I started in the 80s, which would mean nothing to people that say started in the 2000s, I still can't look at something properly unless I look at it under natural daylight. I can't use artificial light.
Have you tried the yacht light?
Yeah, nowadays, I'm sure I could train myself, but the thing is, I started off with natural light. That's my base.
Well, I can't argue with natural light. Thank you very much.
No, and thank you for your information.
Richard Moss, you've been very patient and welcome.
Yes. Good evening, Joan. Good evening, Robert. There's one little thing which has puzzled me here, and I'm probably being very silly about this. But right at the beginning, you said we were looking at a stamp which had got an X number of pieces of type on it, and the one we were going to look at had got one less piece of type.
Yes.
What I'm not quite clear about is whether in actual fact the 1 cent is a 4 cent that was printed with one piece of type missing. Is that a silly question or is it a proper one?
Well, it's a fair question because it's been asked of another version of that stamp. I'm absolutely convinced that it is a 1 cent and the letters are O, N, and E. And I think anybody would be, also the relative positions of 4 and 1. It's, if you had a, let's say you had a perfect 4 cent, let's say you had the original die, or at least the original compilation. If you took one of the letters out, they would be offset in reverse into a position where the 1 is. So I don't think, I think this is, well, I can't say this is the root flaw of the Peter Winter copy, because I think that falls flat on its face on just so many grounds. But no, it's a perfectly valid question. It sort of goes to the question that in the Harmer Rook catalogue of 1935, it's described as an error. And I can't see how anybody could have ever written that, because there's no way that, you know, where errors of color exist, where, you know, 5 cents are printed in 2 cents, and you get a stamp that should have been blue being red. This was a case of the 1 cent was almost certainly, well, at least to my mind, printed first, because it's the right color and it's the right stamp. And I think they were delivered to the office, and I think they stayed at the post office, but the postmaster said, we're not running out of 1 cent stamps, we're running out of 4 cent stamps. So they went back and they printed the 4 cent, and then that's where we get the 4 cent that we know. The only problem was they didn't have a blue ink. They didn't really need 1 cent, so they printed the 4 cent in red. But as one of our questioners was saying earlier, won't it be nice when we can examine the paper of a 4 cent compared with a 1 cent and satisfy ourselves that it is exactly the same ink, or it isn't? Well, sorry to answer a question with a question.
Thank you very much. In some ways, it was when you showed that catalogue with the word error that made me think twice about that one, because I'd never even thought about that before.
Oh, well, as if it inspires a little thought, my task is complete.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Paul Davey, you have a question. Thank you very much for attending.
Just a question and observation. Are there examples where the 4 cent black on magenta has been looked at over a longer period of time? So maybe it was scanned at the Smithsonian in, I don't know, 1990, 95, something like that, and then 30 years later you can see if there have been any changes. That might give a
do you know,
an indication that might be possible with the 1 cent.
Do you know? No, I do not think so. But that, of course, is the single smartest idea. Let's get them to do that, because they may not be able to get their hands on the 1 cent anymore, but it really shouldn't be that difficult to get hold of a 4 cent. So maybe that's the way to go, because, you know, you can only re-examine the past so far, but the future is ours to do with as we please. So yes, I think if I were to make a suggestion, it would be the Smithsonian actually watch them now. You know, red colors are subject to change in light. But the funny thing is, it's only this stamp, because of its celebrity, if you like, that attracts so much question. And of course, it's all good because it just adds to it. And if it is morphing, or shall we say, the colors mutating over the years, well, maybe we take the analogy of fine wine, which again changes in color as it ages, doesn't necessarily means it gets any worse. So I don't know, but it's an interesting question, and it's probably the root of the answer for the future.
Thanks.
It's worth mentioning the 4 cents comes in 2 shades anyway, magenta and carmine.
Yeah.
Also undiscovered is the fact, this was borne out by examination with the Tapling collection, that the stamp, the magenta stamp, comes in 2 thicknesses of paper. That's so far not been reported, thick and thin paper.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Which would you think matches the 1 cent?
That was impossible to compare. Yet to be done.
I was going to say probably the thinner one, because it's about as thin a paper as I think I've come across. That's fascinating. That's good. It's rather interesting, of course, because if you read back through the ancient texts, when they were trying to figure out what the order of the stamps were in British Guiana, I mean, I think that they had the 56 issue as having 8 types. Am I correct? I think even the earliest writing, I think in Denny, Bacon's earliest writings, there were numerous, because the people came to the conclusion that the pressure of the stripe when the stamp was, you know, did make a difference, and created the illusion that there were far, far more. But I think we are fairly well set now that they were printed in 2s, just the type 1 and the type 2.
Yeah, I think that's Patrick Pearson's original work. I think that there's a pair in the Tapling collection as well, I think.
Yeah, he had access to a good many copies of the 4 cent to look at. And I think his conclusion, I'm not at home, so I can't reach for the article he wrote, was that the 1 cent was actually printed in the middle of the 4 cent runs. And because the setting changed a bit. So there were some 4 cents printed, then the 1 cent, and then some more 4 cents.
It's all 421. Sorry, 414. Interesting.
Yes, on the magenta. I haven't got the article in front of me, and my memory's not that good. But of course, you've got it printed on all the other color papers as well. The blue colored through the.
Well, that's actually I consider that to be good news. But of course,
because originally, I mean, Tyson and Howe had reckoned there were four positions on the plate, but Patrick, I think, comprehensively disproved that.
Got it down to 2, and that, of course, was my observation regarding the printing press that was used, because there were a little plate of 2 stamps did not get used on a full-size printing press, which is rather sad for British Guiana, I think.
I want to just thank Rob, the co-host. He did an excellent job. Thank you so much for all your help. Feel free to jump in. And Raphael, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Robert, once again, everybody had told you that a great presentation. I'm going to even say something more, a great discussion. You're a very knowledgeable person, which we appreciate. I have kind of a controversial.
Oh, I'm losing your audio. I'm sorry.
questions at a certain point. So has the, can you hear me better now?
Yes, I
Can you hear me
can.
better now?
Yes.
Okay. So, has the
Oh, I'm losing you, I'm afraid.
city of the stamp being questioned regarding? Can you hear me better
Raphael,
now?
yeah, you could, if you want to try turning off your video and speaking,
Okay,
maybe
I'll
that,
do that.
that would help.
I'll do that. I just turn it off. Do you hear me better now? Not really.
It's very slow and slurred.
Oh, okay. So let me see if I can move around outside of my house. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So very simple. Has the authenticity of the stamp been questioned over time? And if you have any stories of any information regarding the questioning of the authenticity of the stamp?
Well, it seems the biggest question of authenticity was the one that was raised by Judge Philbrick, which was really in the 1880s. And I think that that was just a simple misunderstanding because he believed he'd seen the stamp and he actually hadn't. And so when he was faced with the writings of Edward Bacon, he expressed reservations. And of course, when something becomes so incredibly famous, then any amount of information that is slightly damaging suddenly becomes more interesting. I mean, we just need to look at the culture of today, which is, you know, pick holes, and pick more holes. But much as I am convinced that there is no other example, I don't think, you know, it's like inverted jennies. There are plenty of imitations, but only the one genuine stamp. Bad example with the inverted jenny, of course, because there are 100 of them, but there are real ones and there are fake ones, and there's really no, there's nothing in between. I've never even seen a good fake. But I don't know. Hard to answer that question.
Jason, I guess you've been to Guyana? I guess it's a pretty damp and.
Yeah, I was there in July of, I don't know, 2013, 2014, and had a really wild experience because I went overland to Kaiter. Most people just fly in because it's way in the jungle, but I can only describe it as a midnight boat ride of death in a little dugout canoe with a motor strapped onto it in the pitch black, and it's a long story, but anyway, it was a really interesting experience.
Sounds perfect.
Yeah, so check out Kaiter Falls if you ever happen to be in Guyana, and unless you're into like extreme hardcore adventure, I recommend the flight.
Oh, I have children for that.
Wow, well, this is really fascinating. Are we all? Yeah. You can say something.
Hey, Keith.
How are you?
I'm good, sir.
The best observation I've had tonight about this is you look a lot better without a beard.
Okay, now he has to go pick up my son.
The good news is it comes off in 12 days. I always shave on my birthday.
Oh.
So that's it. And anyhow, it's here to replace what's missing here. It was the British Guiana that did this to me.
That must have been awesome to just have it in your hands like twice. So.
Do you know what was so good about it? It was the second time, because I wasn't scared. I'll be completely honest, I was scared of it. And I'm sure, David, when you deal with those wonderful Mauritius stamps, in some ways you have to, it's like when somebody new moves in, you're so wary of it, but then the second time you actually clear your mind and you get to look at it properly. I'm not saying
you mustn't be scared. Never be scared.
But there's an element of terror there, and that went the second time. And I was so glad. I mean, even though we did the view last year in the pandemic, and so few people actually got to show up. But you know what I did is I took it out of the damn case and I let people hold it. I didn't give them the stat. It was still inside, but they got to hold it. They got their pictures taken with it. We sat around a table, we passed it, and it was stamp collecting the way it should be. It's getting to the point. We also sold the inverted Jenny plate block, which is a perforated stamp. Which means you can't even, you don't want to breathe near it because God forbid a perforation should go on you. But this was something that the Jenny block is going to be almost behind plate glass. It's going to be, we are being so removed from ours, at the very high level, we're being so removed. With the tackling stamps, I guess you get to really look at them. Which is, that's the way that it should be. We lose a bit of the hobby when we start separating ourselves from the stamps. And it was, I mean, it was an honor to be able to, and I, like you, I mean, I've dealt with a lot of fabulous things, but I've actually got to hold them. And that's what you have to do. Fortunately, there's plenty of stamps that you can hold and play silly buggers with, but the rare ones do seem to be becoming a little remote. So yes. Anyhow, I'm getting a little sappy about it, but yeah, that was the best part of selling it, being with the people that managed to get in to actually pass it around and play with it. And I think everybody enjoyed it, which was really good. And of course, it's a testament to most of the owners over the last century, really, from hiding something away, they all, got the stamps out and got them out so people could actually look at them. I mean, in that dark era that I grew up in, the 60s and the 70s, didn't really get to see very much in terms of the really great stamps, because not a lot of them were in circulation. But, just recently, the New York show, there were fabulous things there. So I don't know. And I remember, it's actually interesting having David here, because as an 8-year-old, I went to Olympia. And of course, I saw the Kenai Mauritius, which made no impression on me. But with hindsight, I'm so glad that I got to see it.
Well, I was 16 in 1970 and have met Kenai since. It was a great privilege. What you're describing is that bonding, that getting together, which you just can't describe otherline.
Yeah,
absolutely, we're at one.
Exactly. I mean, we make friendships in this rather strange industry. And the great thing is your best friends can be the people you disagree with the most, and vice versa. And definitely. If there isn't a little bit of, if we all agreed, we should go home. But it's, yes, it's nice that it still exists, and it's been nice to have been a part of it. And I hope it keeps going. How was the London show?
Oh, excellent. Little quiet for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But otherwise, very good. Well received.
Oh, that's good. That's good. No, I would have liked to have come to it, but to be honest, I just can't be bothered to get on a plane at the moment. Once they finally normalize everything, I'll start traveling again. But it is.
What is very interesting is that the late Cal Hearn, in giving a presentation to the Collectors Club, asked one question. He was very good at asking difficult questions. And the question was, has anyone thought of looking at the newspaper, the printed British Guiana, and seeing whether the typeface is the same?
No, that was done because it is the typeface on the cotton reels, but it is the typeface on the cotton reels, but it's apparently not on the British Guiana. And the old story that the slug for the ship was always reputed to be from the shipping news, only the Royal Gazette never printed the shipping news. So, but you've got to imagine, type is one of those things that survived. Wouldn't it be marvelous to find the typeset that they actually used? Apart from the obvious sort of problems that somebody might use them again. But I'm not actually sure. But I am sure that the cotton reels were Royal Gazette type. And I think that the 56s weren't. But somebody would know better. But David, can you imagine that somebody hasn't done that?
You'd be amazed what people haven't done that's still to do.
Well, yes, no, I am as well, but this one's got an awful lot. I mean, we found this. There are sporadic editions of the Royal Gazette around. Of course, we found a copy of the April 4th one, which we would love to have said that the stamp was used on, even though that stamp had to have been misused. It was misplaced and it was used on an envelope. I sort of feel it in my bones rather than anything else. And I'm surprised that, I mean, even in England, stamps exist on newspapers. We British don't have a great tradition of using newspaper stamps, but wherever they do, France, Austria, where they were particularly prolific, they exist in droves. How did a stamp on a newspaper not exist? I mean, let's face it, nobody really knows the story of the 2-cent newspaper rate either. We know it was suspended for papers, which were pretty much all of them that were less than a week old, but we don't know when it was reinstated. And we know that the 1-cent 53s were used. There are known blocks of the 1-cent making up the 4-cent rate for delivery in February. So, to be honest, we know they hadn't run out of 1-cent stamps. And wouldn't it be nice if Waterloo hadn't destroyed their records or had their records destroyed? There are so many if onlys, but as I said, again, that's just part of the joy of it. It is ungodly late where you are.
Yes.
Oh, it's 1 o'clock. Yes, gosh.
I don't. So from what you last said about the stamp, has it gone on the ETF market, or the images of it gone on the ETF market? Shares at $100 each.
No, that's actually for your £100 or your $132. Although I looked at the website the other day. I'm not sure you can actually buy them in America at the moment. It's my understanding that for your £100, depending on how many of the shares you buy, you get certain rights. But it is just a shareholding in the real estate, as it were. So whatever 1/80,000th of a square inch is, I'm not quite sure. let's face it, if it's done just on a linear basis, your share will be thicker than it will be. It'll have more depth than it will have surface area, or the front surface area. So I don't know.
Sadly, it's not done on a sort of timeshare basis, so you get an hour a year in your collection. That would be good.
That would be a lot to ask, but I would think that if it really something as unique as this, a limited number of ETF, I don't know what it stands for, is where electronic images of art that you can own.
It's a blockchain configuration, so it's another version of a non-fungible token, or what horrible words they use. It's got something to do with a very large Ponzi scheme.
Apparently, they've sold 15% of the stamp so far.
Okay.
Yeah, I understand, but as I said, I wish them well. It's something new, but I won't be buying a bit.
I have a challenging question. If you were to actually get the color right and make reproductions, how would you mark the stamp so that everyone would know that this is a reproduction, a high quality reproduction?
I think the truth is you wouldn't need to, because I don't think the technology is actually there. Oh, actually, I know. You find out whether it's on the thick or the thin paper, and you print it on the other one.
David, you had a screen share you mentioned in the chat?
I don't know.
No, sorry, was it David? I think it's a different David from Cape Cod.
Right.
Oh.
I don't hear him. Okay.
Well, it's about time David got used to the fact that there's lots of people with the same name. I've been dealing with the two Roberts for the last day.
So he's got, okay. Oh, he has a share, not that he wanted to screen share. He owns a share.
Oh, he owns one.
Cape Cod.
Okay, well, good for him.
So
good for him.
My bad. You could tell I'm a techno person. It's like when I see share, I think, oh, Zoom, right? But
no, I mean, and it's a tangible share. It's not an electronic representation of a. I mean, yes, you own a little bit of it. I'm not sure whether there are many things I would like to own just a little bit of. I mean, I think our other participant who suggested a timeshare might be onto a better thing. Here it is for you bought 1 point, you bought 3 seconds.
Goodness.
No, you bought 3 seconds in 25 years, 4 months, 2 days, and 6 minutes. So if you can hang on, you can, because, it goes back to the same thing. It's like, I don't want to own a little bit. I just want to have it in my hand for a while. The best, for my own personal, and this was after we sold it for the second time, I came in for the day and I just sat in a room with it and just enjoyed having it for a while. But
I must admit, the thing I would like to see is it in context. So with the rest of the values of the set on a page. And that was one of the things in Stockholm with the 3 skilling yellow, the Swedish stamp, was actually to see it with the rest of the set in the right place.
Well, I think.
Oh, Frank, speak up.
I could be rather snarky there, I suppose. I said, why would you want to see a color trial in a bunch of issued stamps?
Frank, feel free to unmute and just jump in.
All right.
But you can fight back.
In 1986, it was at Ameripex, and I got to see it there. And it was in a pane with all the rest of the British Guiana stamps, because that's where DuPont showed it first. That was his first major international show of that thing.
That was
and it had its own armed guard standing next to the frame. That's how we could find it amongst all the frames of stamps. Look for the armed guard. That's how we were told to find it.
That, of course, was, it wasn't DuPont though, was it? It was Ray Mader. And
no, DuPont owned it at that point in time.
No, it's a joke. No, it's a joke. It's a joke. DuPont used the pseudonym Ray Mader, which is an anagram of Demerara. And it was actually the only show. It did go to Australia, but it was the only competitive show that it went to. And it won the Grand Prix. So, and you just mentioned the example that I would have said. Much as John DuPont was always a royal pain when cataloging it, because of course he was the story that was the only story that anybody wanted to write about, because he murdered somebody and got sent to prison. But you couldn't, it was politically unsound to write lyrically about the fact that he put together an absolutely brilliant collection of British Guiana. He did exactly what people wanted to see and what our previous commentator said. He gave you the postal history of British Guiana, which is these ragtag stamps, which actually just tell a beautiful story about a country going through the teething issues of starting a proper grown-up postal service. And it was a terrible shame. And
going back to what you were saying about owning it for 3 seconds, does that mean you've got 3 seconds to sign the back?
Oh no, that's right. I think signing rights are completely separate. I think we're going to have to get an upcharge on that. In a lot of ways, I do think you should own it for a certain amount of time before you're allowed to inscribe. And I'm not quite sure about whether a pencil is agreeable anymore. But there's, I don't know. I think these days, if you're going to pay, I don't know, 8 or 10 million for something, you should, within reason, be allowed to do what you like for it. It sort of goes back to one of the first things I was ever told about stamps, because especially in the US, the market for never hinged versus lightly hinged or what have you is so incredible, it's ridiculous. But as somebody once said to me, you only really look at a stamp from one side, and certainly when you display it, you only display one side. And it seems it only becomes a debate once the stamp goes over a certain dollar figure. So I don't know, jury's out on that one.
As you were talking about the stamp, I was hoping we didn't have any psychologists in the, I could see this being an analytical study on, like, the way you were talking about the stamp, it was as if it were like a potential husband or wife. It's like I held it, I'm like, well, I just hope this doesn't become a talk of someone's class paper.
Shall I give you would you like a silly piece of trivia?
Go ahead.
Do you know what else or who else appeared in 1856? Sigmund Freud. He was born in 1856, as was Nikola Tesla. A pretty useless year otherwise.
Another suggestion, any owner of part of it can sign it if they can sign it in their 3 seconds within the surface area of the back that they've purchased.
Oh, nano writing. I'll have to get my, maybe you're going to have to buy a few squares just to get an initial in.
IBM can do it in 1 square.
Yes, very true.
John DuPont could be a member of the Royal as a murderer, but he couldn't be a member of the Royal as a philatelic forger.
That's good.
Wow.
That's good. But to be honest, I can see the sense in that, because forgery is unforgivable, but some people do actually need to be killed.
Okay, let's not get that quote.
I think, yeah, premeditated murder is just a little bit horrible, but
recording is still on.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Bad. Actually, the other thing that it's funny, there are all those parallels for 1856. The Crimean War ended, which is unfortunately sort of rather close to home at the moment with the Ukraine situation. That area, it's, you know, more things change, the more they say the same. Rather strange.
All right. So what is a second rarest stamp?
You name it. There are so many of them.
A very famous collector once said, "This stamp is unique, but it's not rare."
Frank, you have the answer.
Oh, that's actually very good.
The 3 Skilling Banco. It's the only other one that's won and has gone for that high amount of money.
I don't know. Unfortunately, its sale history makes me think that it never actually sells. It's actually rented for a short period.
They tried to do the same thing
Without
with
pointing
that Stanley Gibbons is doing, and getting a group of people to, you know, own it rather than a single person. And it didn't quite work out as well.
No.
I wish Stanley Gibbons good luck on this one.
I think it's a great thing they're doing for the philatelic market to support such a wonderful stamp like the British Guiana. So
well, they are publicizing it, which is good. And as long as it works, unfortunately, it could backfire. And one's always concerned that Stanley Gibbons is, you know, with David and I'm sure all our earliest catalogues and everything, it was all Stanley Gibbons. Everything was Stanley Gibbons. You know, there was nothing else. And Stanley Gibbons was great. And then there was that business with Letraset. And then there was, it's like Stanley Gibbons has had a troubled older age. And I think we're, as Englishmen, we're rather protective towards it because it's Stanley Gibbons. But boy, do they seem to botch things on a regular basis. And I hope they do a little bit better. I mean, I don't think anybody's actually made any money out of Stanley Gibbons in 50 years. So I'm not quite sure. But I think we'd have to go back to Mick Michael because I think it was running as a good business back then.
Yeah.
So yes, I mean we're all protected because it's as Brits we're protected because it's ours and it kind of existed. It's not like Scott, which has sort of been in, you know, it's always. But it's, Scott in all the time I've been here has always belonged to something else. And JW.
Scott used to belong to the Harmer family.
Yep.
Oh, you had it for a while?
Well, he started it. He started the catalogues, I believe.
Well,
not
catalog.
HR. Is, you know, that was George. I think
it was J.W. Scott that started the company because he was an Englishman that came to America.
Yeah, it was a branch. It was a branch of the Harmer family that owned it. Not your branch, the other branch, the Harmer
Yeah.
Rock branch had it.
Yeah. Yeah, that was his brother. I have the lineage because I traced it. It was HR's brother, I think.
HR's brother's son.
Son, right.
Right. Yes, no, they said, but again, it's all British imports, isn't it?
Hey.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know,
But anyway, Edward, there was a great talk at Stampex 2 years where I got Tom Mazza to give a debate on what was the first postage stamp. And I had Tom Mazza doing the United States, vying for it. We had a boy named Andrew Gill, Alex Gill, doing Brazil. And Alex is a young philatelist, and I think he did a brilliant job doing that, and he did the bullseyes. And then we had a pitch hitter, Bruce Marston, filled in for the I think it was Michon, who was going to do it but broke his had to go for an operation, and Bruce did a great job. So that's another one you might want to look up, because that was a really fun debate also, like a philatelic.
Actually, that was one of the first ones, like the webinars here I saw. I ended up going with the, well, I like the Brazilian because the Swiss ones were for individual cantons. It's like, I felt like when postage stamps should cover more than one city.
We'll have to bring that debate back. But anyway, it was a fun, fun type discussion. I'm glad you attended it. That was really a fun. I like the concepts of doing a philatelic debate, because it's especially one that could include other people. And I think that's a wonderful way to engage people intellectually and bring your discipline into it, as we did tonight with the papers and the inks and typesets and the condition of Guyana. I think that's just really, really fascinating. I think thank you, Robert Scott, for bringing that to us. And Rob, you were fantastic.
I didn't bring it. I just dragged it out from somewhere and passed it on.
I didn't know.
We don't do these things.
On the catalogs, this came up more recently. Some of the South American stamps would have the description in Scott would be airplane against a mountain. And then I realized there was something missing there when I went into some of the Eastern Europeans, whereas actually find out what type of airplane that was depicted, because I think the airplane on stamps is a way of looking at the history of airplanes and the history of airmail and all the kind of technical issues, like what kind of airplanes were better for, which airplanes worked best in terms of reliability and design and carrying capacity. And when did it matter? At what point did it matter to carry a lot more letters? Because I'm just thinking that now, if airmail, the initial airmail might have just one bag, but when it gets to be a lot of bags, you want to be able to carry you want an airplane that can carry a lot, and also, it has proven itself it can deal with the weather.
Or not, in many cases.
Yeah.
And then that makes the mail more valuable, right? Then you have crash covers.
Oh, well, for the longest period, the crash covers have always been, were always the better.
Yeah.
Which is a bit ironic, right? The unsuccessful flights are more expensive. But we always said, like, Rob, I think we were talking about this, about how it would be nice if museums could let people rent out their, as opposed to keeping them there, let a wealthy collector just put it in an exhibit and rent it out. They could generate revenue and display it at the same time.
Definitely.
Of course.
We'd have to get better security than the library had for their inverted jennies.
Yeah, we have to get more insurance, I think, just to insure. But anyway, well,
be that far off before we can see things holographically, and share them, bring them into our homes, play with them.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Actually, it's rather interesting that most of the major artworks that go into Sotheby's now, they have the machine. They do these, you know, they scan them into these versions of non-fungible tokens. Just as insurance, it's the marking for authenticity, because it's the simplest way to do it. Wonder how long before that will advance into exactly what you're talking about. You know, you'll just get three-dimensional representations coming in. They will be perfect in every way.
Well, you know, Keith collects forged covers, so he
I love Keith's forged covers.
So yeah, he always has fun with that. So
well, some of Keith's best old forged covers are the ones that turned out to be not forged.
yeah, well, stay tuned for that story, because there's a couple when I was doing, sorry for the dogs, doing the presentation, that I found he made a mistake.
Oh, but no, there have been, you know, attitudes and information changes. There were lots of things that were considered right that are now wrong, and that were considered wrong and are now right. But the former is usually more true than the latter. But
actually, as far as these unique ones, I'm on the low end of the market. I wouldn't mind reasonable quality replica, or no, not replicas, or copies that I could put on letters to people that I, you know, as a point to make the mail I send out a little bit more interesting. I would just want to make certain that no one's ever going to realize that people will always realize that was a slightly expensive copy, and don't even think that you can pass it off as something else.
And go to discount postage.
Well,
it would have no postage value, but it would like go with the Christmas letter. It's like that you have your favorite stamps on the Christmas letter. There's no postal value, but it would be just spice up the letter, because a lot of what you send out, a lot of the stamps you're sending out your letters on, not that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You'll excuse me all. It's now 1:30 in the morning.
Yes, it's getting late.
I'm going to leave.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Robert.
Thanks, Paul. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Likewise.
David, we're going to have to touch base with another good debate that we could get people riled up on. So,
good idea.
Oh, what's a good subject for getting people riled up on?
Is yesterday's mail postal history?
I don't know. We'll find something.
Could we remove the gum on classic stamps?
Good night, all.
Okay, good night. Thank you very much.
Good night. Sweet dreams.
Yeah.
I'm also leaving, Robert. Well done and most enjoyable.
Good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, Trevor.
Yes, thank you, Robert from Canada. I really enjoyed your presentation.
That's very kind of you.
Hope to see you again. Thank you.
And Bob, you did a great. We still get letters about your program too. So
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be a follower from now on.
So yeah, it's pretty nice. Membership's really expensive here. It's $0. So.
Oh, can I buy a share in a membership?
Yeah, I should start selling shares, right?
I'll come and take Keith out for lunch.
So next week is going to be back to the liberated country, or the occupied countries.
So Edward, the thing is, the British Empire study groups only really rents, not rents, we would only meet there. So we're not really part of the Collectors Club. So we're like, we're totally independent, which is why everything's bootstrapped. Yeah, we're not, we just have, we cross-pollinate. Like you'll find in philately, a lot of people are members of the same groups. So you'll see the same people, and it's very easy to not know what club you're at because all the people look the same.
Well, if any of you are ever come by the Perfin Society's publications, I have something coming up in April and in June.
Oh, well, happy to put it on our website. That would be fine. Okay. You know, that the publications there. But yeah, and it was, I talk about, Irene was a big supporter of the British Empire study group, and she was devastated to learn that the Collectors Club was selling the building. So that was.
Oh, she knew before she went.
Yeah, she knew, and she was like, she had resolved that she was not going to move with it.
No, so. She was. Well, the good news is, I'm sure there's a part of her that will be in that building until the end of time.
Yeah, I think so too. She loved that. You know, she knew the history, everything about that. It was just like Joel said. She just loved the building, and she liked art. That's what art and music and all those things that she knew. Greek. I mean, how many people know Greek and Latin? And oh, Robert and Rich. I mean, I was always envious of those people who could read Latin and Greek. And
I would, before we all wrap up and what have you, I would just like to add my own personal tribute to Irene Bromberg. When I did the catalogue, I hadn't met Irene, and I met her for the first time because I wanted to get to the library at the Collectors Club in New York. And a more lovely person I have never met. We hit it off straight away, and I would turn up with a cup of tea for her, and she would open the place up for me, and she just couldn't have been more helpful. And we wouldn't have produced the catalogue that we did without her help. She was absolutely solid gold. And when we got together last year, because I hadn't seen her for a while, we took off again just where we left off. She was the most amazing woman, and I loved her to death. So if there's, if I could, I don't know, if I could.
Here.
I'm just so sorry that she wasn't here to enjoy this, because she would have loved it.
Yeah.
So this one's dedicated to Irene.
Yeah. So Sabina worked with Irene very closely down at the club, and we will be publishing, I'm working with her husband Joel to, obviously it's very difficult for him, and we missed the deadline for the CCP, but we will be publishing her obituary in the next issue, and we'll get it online. And you know, as I was writing it with her husband, there were so many amazing facts about Irene that people didn't know, like the number of languages she spoke. And you know, some people would refer to her as, you know, the secretary. Well, she had a doctorate, so she was more than just a secretary, just an amazing woman. So stay tuned. Yeah, as soon as we get it, I will publish it on the British Empire Study Group site. Also, I'm not sure what the Collectors Club, what their decision was regarding publishing it online. We did get them to put the notice on, so that was really good.
She was very kind to me, and we had a good friendship for the few years that I knew her.